Welcome to the LIV BYG Podcast, where real estate expert Nick Paynes shows you that everyone can build wealth through real estate investing. Nick and his featured guests will give you the tools, resources, and expert information you need to leverage real estate into a wealth-building strategy, so you can stop worrying about your 9-to-5 and start to live big. Here's Nick with today's episode.
All right, welcome everybody to episode 1 of the LIV BYG Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Paynes. I'm super excited to just kind of dive right in today. This is one of my favorite topics. We're going to talk about the power of appreciation. So don't wait to buy real estate. Buy real estate and wait. I'm here today with with Matt Kurkowski. He's one of my partners in Black Yeti Group. Charlie is another partner of mine. He's not here today, but Matt and I are going to chat a little bit about kind of our experiences in real estate. And so he will also be a kind of a recurring guest on the show. So excited to have him here today. Matt, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Matt, tell us, let's start off a little bit with a little bit about your background. When you got started in real estate and kind of what your game plan was at the time.
Okay, so started with my dad. We bought a few houses and we're flipping those. That was pre-2008 and the crash. Made some money doing that, and then the crash hit, and selling our last flip was really tough. And after that, kind of stopped for a little while. Wasn't sure what to do. I'd always heard of owning rental properties as, problem tenants, toilets overflowing in the middle of the night, and nothing that sounded appealing.
Okay, so you were just like in the flip game, basically. You didn't want anything to do with rentals.
Yeah, that was never a thought.
Okay.
That was how it started.
Okay, and then when did you, so that was at the end of
the run-up before.
2009, 2010 is kind of when you stopped?
So I think the last one we sold, I remember it was the Obama, was it the Firsttime homebuyer tax credit?
Yeah.
It was like that, whenever that
was. Like 2010, 2009, 2010, somewhere there.
Somewhere there, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So that ended, we missed getting that last one sold before that, and then it kind of sat there for a while. And
okay.
Yeah, so it was...
And then, when did you have your first rental property?
So it would have been about 2 years later.
Okay.
Was talking to Charlie, their business partner, and he was telling me, yeah, rentals are great. Money comes in, pays the mortgage, got some extra every month. Doesn't have to deal with toilets and problems all the time. So I actually moved out of my current house, made that into a rental, and bought a second primary house that we moved into because less down payment. Just easier than trying to go buy an investment property.
So you did the house hacking method for number 1 at least.
Yep.
And then all right, so that was 2 years later, so that's about 10 years ago now. Mm-hmm. So now it's been 10 years, and how many doors do you have now?
About 40.
40, all rentals basically.
Yeah.
So it's kind of been cool to working with Matt and Charlie. We have some combined experience that involves everything from house flipping to long-term rentals to short-term rentals to duplex to quadplex conversions, long-term rental to short-term rental conversions. I think you even have an 8-plex that is being converted almost to like a motel
basically
type situation. So really everything on the spectrum, from, again, just a normal purchasing of property all the way up to kind of small multifamily. And then as a company, our group is working into the larger multifamily market. So that's what Black Yeti Group is. So that's our website that you can go check out, which is www.blackyetigroup.com. There's more resources there. That's where this podcast is hosted. But you can go on there and learn a little bit more about what we do, kind of look at some of the projects. But what would you say, I think just in general, just one more quick thing kind of on your background. What was the thing that changed your mind from going from saying being a flipper, for example, to I'm going to start holding these and I'm going to just start like acquiring real estate and turning them into rental properties?
I mean, honestly, just getting the first one was the biggest, most difficult thing. Once we had that first one, it was amazing. Just the difference having an extra $500 a month would make. So we had a mortgage that was $1,200 or whatever. We could rent it for $1,700.
Sure.
So not even taking out expenses that, repairs that might come up. I managed the property, so there wasn't a property management expense.
Sure.
But having that just savings account, basically, like we never touched that money. I was originally just thought, I'll have my retirement from working and I'll have 2 houses. And, when it's paid off one day, that's a great extra savings account that we can just use.
Sure.
My mind's, evolved and changed over time from that. But having that extra $500, I remember just having that first rental, our dog had eyelashes growing into her eyeball. And it was like a $1,500 surgery. And we had, me and my wife had jobs and we could have paid for that, but it would have kind of sucked.
Sure.
But having that rental property and having savings, we just had $5,000-$6,000 in the bank, and we were able to just pull it out, pay for it, not put anything on the credit card,
right?
Pay interest. It was that was like the first one. I was like, wow, this thing is constantly paying and saving money, just helping save money. Was a great start.
I think it's the idea that like when you first get started, it's not like life-changing money, right? Like anybody that gets an extra $200, $300 a month, like it's not going to change your life. It's not going to change your lifestyle or the way you live, but you do that 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and then those older rentals start producing, $500 or $600 or $700 per month, and all of a sudden you've got $3,000 or $4,000 a month, in addition to your job, right? Now it starts to be life-changing money, right? Like what would the average person do with an extra $4,000 a month, right? Yeah. That's another full-time job for the median income individual in the United States, right? Mm-hmm. So like all of a sudden you've got this production on the side that has just come together over time, like I said, $40,000, $50,000 a year. And again, not significantly, I don't think at that point you can get, maybe you can quit your job. I don't think it'd be safe at that point to quit your job. But then you escalate that again and you drive that a little bit further. And now all of a sudden you're doing $10,000 a month, $20,000 a month. Yeah. That is life-changing money. And that's something that takes time. It doesn't happen right away. People don't get into the real estate game and just start like cash flowing $10,000 a month. It just doesn't happen unless you get millions of dollars to invest, right? So I think, one of the things that, as to kind of get rolling into today's episode, I mean, there's essentially a quote. It's been around for a long time, but the quote is from Will Rogers. And I think Will Rogers was actually an actor, if I remember correctly, from like the late 1800s or early 1900s, maybe even. And his quote was, "Don't wait to buy real estate and wait." And so the thought process there is pretty simple. It's just like wait for the housing market, wait for appreciation to do its thing. And it's completely understandable because real estate is our hedge against inflation, right? And we know like that's one thing to be true is like there's always inflation, right? Like things are always more expensive than they were the years before. And we're coming out of one of the most inflationary times in the history of the United States, right? Yeah. Basically dating back to the 1980s is the last time we had inflation as bad as we had this last year. We had inflation numbers in the 9.5% range, right? So if you had real estate appreciating at the same time, that's kind of a good problem to have, right? So as much as you think like, oh man, groceries are more expensive, gas is more expensive. Yeah, but all my rental properties are worth more, and it's driving up rents because cost of living is more, and it's more expensive to buy a home. And if it weren't more expensive to buy a home, everybody would buy homes and nobody would rent, right? And so I think like the big thing to look at is we've got this data point that comes from the Federal Housing Finance Authority. And that data point is basically that since 1991, annual home price increases have been 4.3% annually, okay? Since 2000, it's been 4.7%. And in the last 10 years, since 2012, it's been 7.7%. Now, this is a national average, right? We live in a little bit different market here in the Denver market where we've seen numbers significantly higher than that, right? Like we saw double-digit increases for like something like 8 of the last 10 years, right? Something crazy, right?
Yeah.
But even if we just take those numbers, one of the big pushbacks I get from that is people look at those numbers like 4%, 5%, and they compare those, for example, to stock market gains, right? And they're like, well, I can earn 7 to 9% in the stock market. So why would I, invest in real estate if I could just be in the stock market? I mean, like, I hear that argument all the time, but Matt, I'll let you kind of talk about why we're not thinking about that right.
So the big one is leverage. To buy a stock, you have to have 100% of that money. To buy a house, you're going to get a mortgage on it. Typically, in a single family property, you're going to put 20% down, 80% loan to value. So by doing so, essentially 5x is your return.
Yeah.
You're putting 20% versus 100%.
Yeah. If you have 1/5 investment, you're exactly right. You have 5x the return.
Yeah.
And it gets even more powerful when you start thinking about like first-time homebuyer programs or minimum down payment programs, people that can buy houses for 3%, 5%. We have down payment assistance programs in Colorado where you put as little as $1,000 down. I know I sold a handful of clients' homes in the last couple of years, $1,000 down. I remember one of my first clients back in 2018 bought a house, down payment assistance, $1,000 out of pocket is what they brought to the closing table. They bought that place for like $330,000. That house 5 years later is probably pushing $475,000, $500,000.
It's a good $1,000 they spent.
Like, what an incredible return on a $1,000 investment, right? Like, if they were to sell that thing after fees and everything, if they paid everything, they're still looking at like something like $120,000, $130,000 in gain on a $1,000 investment over 5 years, right? Like that annualized number is massive.
It's crazy.
And it's not even close to, the funny thing is if you took that same $1,000 and you invested it, instead of saying like, oh, well, maybe they invested into a 401k, right? That same $1,000 over that same period of time, I mean, I think would be worth less than $2,000 at this point, based on what the stock market's done, right?
Yeah.
And so, and even then, I mean, if we take the law of 72, how long it takes to double your money, we look at an average stock market return of say 7 to 9%. Yeah, in 5 years, that $1,000 wouldn't even have doubled, right? And instead, it's up 140-fold.
Yeah. Right.
So like it's incredibly powerful when you look at it from that standpoint, and even on the investment side. Look at the numbers that you can generate with a 20 or a 25% down payment. Because you're exactly right. Like the only way to buy stock is with cash. You can use a margin account like that. But you can't leverage 90% worth.
Yeah.
Right. Like your margin account has some type of, call option. You still have to have money in there to do it.
Yeah. And there's the downside risk if it goes down. You can get, like you said, that call.
Right.
You
have to sell it.
Yeah.
Where the real estate game, we take a 20% drop. You just sit on the property. You just wait, right? So like you buy real estate and you wait. And one of the cool things too is if you go on, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but the website is FRED. It's some federal registry that gives information. But one of the historical figures that you can look up there is you can see the appreciation of home prices over time. And one thing that you'll see, Matt, is, and I think the data goes back to the 1920s or 1930s or something like that. There's actually no period in that history, it's over 100 years, that in a 10-year period, there's negative returns on real estate. So like if you take the Great Depression, you take the Great Recession, and you put whatever, the worst year of those times, you put it at the beginning of a 10-year period, you put it at the end of a 10-year period, you put it smack dab in the middle of a 10-year period, none of those periods have negative return, right? So you look at like the Great Recession was a huge housing crisis. It was a banking crisis that kind of foiled over into the housing realm, right? And so if you take that crash in 2008 and you go, okay, well, let's say you start in 2000, and then you go to 2010, which we're just barely coming out of it. You're still up because the appreciation from 2000 to 2006 was so great that even with that massive kind of pullback or correction or crash or whatever you want to call it, we still have positive gains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even like last year here in Colorado, for example, last year we had a 17% run up in the first 3 months of the year, right? So from January to March with 17% run up. And then we lost almost all of it. But people only saw that backside. They were like, oh my gosh, the market's crashing. But like beginning of year to end of year total, our market was up like 3 to 5%, depending on where you are. It was still up.
Yeah.
Right. So, but people, all they saw was the downside. So when they were selling their house like in September, October, they were, frustrated with the fact that their neighbors got 10 or 15% more than they did. And they just sold 5 months ago in February.
Yeah.
But or March or whatever. But what they're failing to see is had they sold their house in January or December, the month prior, the year prior, they would have sold it for less than what they were selling it for now in September.
Yeah.
Right. So looking at bigger picture is what people were failing to see, And so I just think like the leverage piece is so powerful because people look at it and they go, well, historically speaking, home appreciation or house appreciation like only slightly outpaces inflation, right? Like historical inflation is like just over 2%. Now in the last like 10 to 20 years, it's more than that. But also look at the last 10 years of real estate, 7.7%, right?
Yeah.
So like the leverage piece, even though we're only getting 4% annualized return, or I should say 4% appreciation on the property, 4% appreciation on a $400,000 property is $16,000. And if you can buy that $400,000 property for $20,000 for a 5% down payment, like your ROI is like 80%, right? Like annually.
Yeah.
That's 10 times the stock market. Yeah. Right. And so that's the piece that I think people fail to see. And then, they'll always make excuses about, well, it costs more to buy real estate. It costs more to get out. It takes longer to get out. Sure it does.
Mm-hmm.
Like
those inefficiencies are why you have those opportunities.
That's exactly right. Right. If something were like easy to do,
if there's like stock you click and sell, then you don't have any of that.
And everybody would be doing it every time they get the tip, right? Like crypto's a great example. Like before really crypto blew up, do you know how hard it was to buy Bitcoin?
I'm sure it's difficult.
It was really difficult. Like the process that you had to go through, and not just like Bitcoin was relatively easy, but buying like a different one, buying like one of the other coins that was out there was incredibly difficult. The process that you had to go through just to buy it was a pain in the butt. And then once it became a little bit more mainstream and Coinbase came out and you could just download the app and buy it, then Bitcoin ran from like $1,000, which is when it was, even prior to that, it was way less than that, but it was, $1,000 per coin. And then it ran to like 20,000 in a matter of months because Coinbase came out and made it really easy to just transfer money from your bank account and buy it. Right. So you're exactly right. Like if things are easy, then more people would do it. But yeah, buying real estate isn't necessarily easy to do. I think it's a simple process.
Yeah, it's not necessarily easy.
And they're liquidating it too can be tough, right? It's not, you don't go on and click and money's in your account, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
but it's always worth it. Like the first property we bought, I had to sell my truck to figure out a way to get it. That was how I got my down payment. Luckily, I had a job where I had a company vehicle that I was using, so I could do that. But that's how I came up with the down payment.
Right.
But there's always a way. If that's what you're determined to do, there's always a way.
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing that people, like the lesson that I try to teach to people, and I think you're in the same boat with me on this, is that like, in order to do this, like in order to really invest in real estate and build yourself some true wealth and maybe like a generational wealth or a legacy portfolio, something you can leave to your kids or basically have a wealth built that's more than you could ever spend, right? There's a sacrifice that has to be made in order to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And people maybe look at us now in our lives and they go, well, it doesn't look like you sacrifice much, right? Like you live in a nice house, you drive in a nice car, whatever it may be, but at some point in our lives, there were some significant sacrifices that were made, right? Like I think you told me on more than one occasion, you and your wife basically emptied your bank account to buy a piece of real estate.
Yeah.
Right?
Like I had to sell my car, emptied out a 401k from an old job that I had to buy one. There was, but doing that made more sense. And we also passed on upgrading our house.
Right.
We could have had a nicer house. We could have moved ourselves sooner into a nicer house. And we did some of that, but was with the intention of, if it's cheaper for us to move because we can have that lower down payment,
right,
than it is to go outright buy an investment property.
right.
So
it's funny. My wife and I had this, we had this thing that we set a goal for ourselves, right? And it was like, for us, it was to buy a piece of real estate every 5 years. And it was like, okay, by the time we were 60, we'd have like 6 or 7 properties. And that would be plenty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we found, first of all, number 2 is the hardest, I think. I think number 2 is the hardest one.
Yeah.
And then after that, there's just kind of a snowball effect, right? Because you can just, that first one is now fully cash flowing. The debt kind of falls off your tax returns. And then you just have to qualify for the new property. And then at some point, when you have positive cash flow on those older properties, you get to start using that income.
Yeah.
And then it really snowballs.
Well, there's 3 things. I mean, 1, if you're saving that cash flow, you have extra savings. So
sure.
You're saving faster. 2, like we talked about depreciation, you just hold it and wait. It's going up in value. So what we did, we tapped back into that equity. So we refinanced, pulled out some cash for a down payment, and that helped us buy the 3rd.
That's right.
And 4th, and continuing on.
Same thing. I mean, we did the same thing. We leveraged that first property. In fact, I've leveraged my first property twice for a total of 4 properties. About 4 properties off of the equity of the first property.
We've refinanced 3-4 times. I can't even remember now
right.
at this point. So it's about, the first one's probably about 3 or 4. The second one's about 2 or 3.
Right.
So yeah.
And I think but what was the sacrifice, right? The sacrifice was always, my wife and I, we house hacked for the first 2 rentals. And then the 3rd place we lived in, well, that's actually our rental too. So I guess you could say we house hacked 3 times, right? But the idea is each time we moved up, we had to be a little bit more reserved, right? Because we could have, like you said, we could have bought more house.
Oh yeah.
And it was very tempting, right? There was a point, I remember there was a point where we got to a time where we were like, wow, we could actually afford to buy a place in one of the nicest neighborhoods in Westminster, right? And for us, it was the Ranch Reserve. We're like, well, we could actually go buy a place in the Ranch Reserve. But it didn't align with our goals, right? Because we were like, the only way we could afford to do that is the way the majority of people buy houses. Sell their old one and move in. And we could have done that. If we would have sold that old, the other 2 actually now, we would have had to sell the first 2. And we would have been able to roll that equity in, and we would have been able to buy something in the Ranch Reserve. And we would have had this big, beautiful house or whatever.
Probably a lowish payment.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been bad.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have been house poor by any stretch of imagination, but we would have lost our portfolio. We would have lost the cash flow. We would have lost the appreciation of those assets. We would have lost the overall value of our real estate, right? We would have sold $600,000 or $700,000 worth of real estate to go into $900,000 worth of real estate instead of, maybe going up to 500 and adding 500 and now having a total of maybe 1.2 million, right? And so the idea was every time we made that move, we had to hold back, right? We held back. We're like, okay, we're not. And what I see when people, especially as an agent, when I'm working with people, the majority of people, if we work with a lender, for example, we say, hey, we got a $500,000 budget. They buy a $520,000 house. 9 times out of 10, they're going to use the top of their budget. I very rarely work with people that are qualified for $500,000 and buy $400,000.
Yeah.
That, it just doesn't happen, right? Because we have this, and I think this is just something innately that we grow up with. Is just this idea, especially as Americans, this idea of instant gratification, right? And we're so used to it now because anything we want, we can get now.
Stream it. Go download it, YouTube, whatever.
Anything. If you need something from Amazon, Amazon, remember when we thought 2-day shipping was amazing, and now Amazon has it same day if you want it. It's those things are crazy. And what it's done is it's taught us as a culture that to embrace this instant gratification.
Yeah. And
the problem is the people that have the instant gratification, it's really hard for them to see down the road and go, I'm doing all this for my 50-year-old me, for my 40-year-old me, for my 60-year-old me, whatever it may be, or for my kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so many people, and again, if we meet people now, I don't think anybody that met you or me would be like, looks like you're holding back or you're sacrificing, right? Like we live good lifestyles now, but at one point, I mean, my first house that I bought, my wife and I lived there. I had like an $800 mortgage payment, right? And we still had a roommate that paid $500 a month.
Yeah.
So our housing payment was $300 a month between the two of us, right? But we didn't need a roommate. But why did I do that? Because I knew at $500 a month, I could make an extra $6,000 a year. And that extra $6,000 a year, if I did that for 2 or 3 years, I have my next down payment. And that meant I didn't have to I didn't have to save a single dollar out of my income if I didn't want to. And I would build up that next down payment.
Yeah. So it's being a little bit uncomfortable now for, something later.
You have to be. I think you have to be uncomfortable now, right?
Like you said, with the instant gratification or, being able to wait, if you can, you can kind of have it all. Now you have those houses, you have a really nice house now.
Right.
Probably nicer than the Ranch Reserve.
Yeah.
So
that's the thing. And all I had to do was wait 5 years. It was 5 years. It wasn't, and
so it happens a lot faster than you think.
It does. That's the big thing. It happens like that 5-year plan for me, that every 5 years buying a home, first one didn't even take that. The first one took 3 years. And then the next one was 2 more years. And then it was like every year. And now it's like, okay, how many can I buy per year? Right? Like how many properties can I buy per year? I mean, how many doors did you add last year?
We bought one 10-unit building, so it's 10. We bought 4-plex, so 14.
You bought an 8? No, you bought a 4. No, sorry, that was the year before. Yeah. The 4 was the one in Longmont?
In Longmont.
Okay, so at least 14 doors last year.
Yeah.
Right? No, there was more than that, because didn't you do a duplex last year too? Or were those the years before?
It's fuzzy. It's close.
Okay. Either way. 14 doors last year, right? So and it's not hard, right? It's not hard. And so I think that's what the big thing I want people to understand is they have to get to a point where they're comfortable being a little bit more reserved, right? Because then you get to a point down the road, again, you get to a point where you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rentals and you have an extra income of $40,000, $50,000 a year. You don't have to save it like Matt and I do. You don't have to. Go spend it.
Yeah.
Go enjoy it. Go on vacation. You know what you can do with $4,000 a month? You could every other month you could go to Hawaii.
Yeah.
Or every 3 months you could go to Hawaii first class.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Think about that.
Oh yeah. Then it changes your life.
That changes your life because you can still keep your job if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Right. And then you could just take that extra income and you can go. People are you can go buy a Ferrari. No problem. You could drive a Ferrari. You could drive a Lambo. No problem. Right? $4,000 a month, $4,000 a month car payment. You get a Ferrari for that. You get a nice Ferrari for that.
But then it's after a week, it's not,
Yeah.
It's fun for a minute.
Right.
Do you need that? No.
Yeah, I do. So, I think if people can get past that I think is the most important piece that people, if they can get past the instant gratification and think hey, if I could just be a little bit more reserved right now, save a little bit of money, not buy as much house as I want to buy, not buy as much car as I want to buy, and take that extra money and go, I'm putting this away for my future, right? And
your future will come a lot quicker than you think.
That's right.
That's the hardest thing. Like you said, it's the instant gratification. People think, that's when they retire and it's so far away, but you'll turn around and it's here.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. Well, there's a couple stats I want to talk about because if you're going to be making a housing payment, which almost everybody makes some type of housing payment.
You gotta live somewhere.
Right? You gotta be somewhere. You might as well own it, is my point. Right? If you're gonna pay rent, you shouldn't. Right? If you're gonna pay rent, you shouldn't. You should just own it. You should pay yourself, right?
That's a guaranteed savings account, if nothing else.
That's right. If nothing else, it's a guaranteed savings. I agree with that. I think that's a great way to put it, right? So let's just put a scenario into place. So imagine this, in 1992, the average home price in the United States was $121,500, okay? And the average mortgage rate at that time was 8.3%. Okay, first of all, that's not a mortgage rate that Matt or I have seen in our house buying lifetimes. So people that are freaking out about maybe current interest rates and they're like, oh my God, interest rates are 6 and 7%, right? Like those are the worst rates we've seen, right, in quite some time. I think even my first house was 5.5%, 6% back in 2010, right? So 8.3%, historically speaking, is a big rate. That's a big rate, right? So 8.3%, 121,000. If you made all 360 payments on a 30-year mortgage, okay, without ever refinancing, so without ever taking the opportunity to refinance when the market turns down, over 30 years, you would make a total payment of $309,000 and change. Okay, so you pay about $310,000 for that property in 30 years, right? But that same property appreciating for those 30 years would now be worth $572,000. And that's at an 8.3% interest rate, right? The problem is people get so caught up in the total cost of a mortgage over 30 years, which first of all, the average person only lives in a home for 7 years. Okay, people move every 7 years on average. So the chances you ever make it to a 30-year, highly unlikely. And then if you do stay in that home for 30 years, the chances that you keep that mortgage for 30 years is also highly unlikely, right? So that people think about this and they go, oh, the mortgage rates are so high. And they use that as a reason to not buy. And even investors, they use it as a reason to not buy. And I think they get so caught up in that they forget about the fact that they're allowed to leverage a massively valuable asset, right? So if you would have just made a 10% down payment on this property back in 1992, right, that would have been $12,150, 10% down, okay? And then you made your monthly payments, which at 8.3% would have been about $800 a month, okay? So, which you would have had to been making a housing payment anyway, right? Would have been rent or whatever, and maybe rent was slightly less. Let's say rent was $600 a month, okay? So yeah, you're gonna pay a couple $100 more, okay? But after 30 years, that $12,000 quote unquote investment would now be worth $572,000. Okay, that's a 4,600% return. It's a massive, massive return.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's huge.
And if you're renting, that's all just gone.
And if you're renting, you would have paid, and you would have eaten those rent increases too. Yeah. Think about that. Like over 30 years, like now the average rent rate, I don't know nationally, but here average rent rate is probably somewhere in the 2,500 range, right? And so let's say nationally it's a little bit lower. Let's say it's 2,000. But I mean, that means just this year alone, you paid $24,000 in rent.
Yeah.
Right. So, and in your first year, you would have paid $10,000. So if we just average that out and we say, okay, on average, you paid $13,000 a year over 30 years, you would have paid $390,000 in rent over that same period, right? Where in this one, you would have paid $310,000 in mortgage. And that's if you never refinanced, right? And this is an 8.3% interest rate, right? So let's say you were able to refinance at some point, and let's just say you had a blended 30-year rate of 6.5%, which still it's on the higher end, okay? So if you had a blended 6.5% rate, you'd save another $47,000 in interest. So you would have actually only paid $362 and change on that property, or $262,000. Yeah, $262,000, and the property's now worth $572, right? So, like, this is the thing that we talk about, and I just have such a hard time when people blindly. I don't want to misconstrue this as people aren't. I think people aren't educated about it. Honestly, is the fact that they will blindly toss money into a 401k, right? And I encourage people out there, if you have an employer match, you should do that. It's free money, right? Like some employers match up to 6% or something like that. That's free money, and you should absolutely do that. Okay, but don't put extra money in it, right? Because here's the American 401k in a nutshell. Like if I came to you, Matt, one day and you didn't know me, we didn't have a relationship, but I came up to you and I was like, hey, Matt, I've got this investment opportunity for you. And it's going to cost you whatever. I could give them a monthly rate or a flat figure. It's going to cost you $10,000. And Matt says, well, what are you going to do with it? And I go, don't worry about that. You don't need to know what I'm doing with it. And I don't know what your return is going to be. And you can't have the money or the returns on it for 30 years. You think Matt's going to cut me a check? Matt, are you going to cut me a check?
Absolutely not.
No, that is the American 401k. Like, that is literally the 401k that people just like toss money into on a monthly basis, right? Yeah. They don't know what it's invested in, right? Because some firm is handling it for them. It's in mutuals, it's whatever. They have no idea, okay? They can't guarantee returns because there are no guaranteed returns. Now, there's no guaranteed returns on anything. You can use historical averages, and that's fine, okay? And then you can't touch it for 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how old you are when you invest it, right? So I get people all the time. In fact, that example I gave you earlier about one of my first clients that bought that house with $1,000, I asked him, I said, are you contributing to a 401k? And he said, yes. And I said, do yourself a favor. Take a couple months off. Don't contribute to the 401k. Save $1,000.
Is that how we got it?
Yeah. Save $1,000 so you can buy a house. And now that $1,000 that would be worth less than $2,000 today in a 401k is worth well over $100,000 in real estate, right? Like, it's not a surprise that the average net worth of a homeowner is 11 times that of a renter, and it has nothing to do with the size of their savings accounts.
It's equity in their house.
It's all the equity in their house.
It's a forced savings account.
It
just makes it easier.
Yeah.
You're gonna pay to have a place, a roof over your head.
Right.
It might be, like you said, it might be a little bit more expensive, but it's forcing you to save.
Right.
And that's the easiest way.
Think about this. This is that last point that I made about, somebody buying at 8.3% and maybe even getting a 6.5% blended rate. Like, let's think about another point on that, right? So higher interest rates are causing people not to buy right now. Like, that's happening. Right. And it's been happening for about the last 6 months. Yeah. Okay. That's why that big pullback in our market happened, right? Because interest rates, not only did it create unaffordability, which that's one thing. If you just can't qualify anymore, that's one thing. But it scared a lot of people out of the market too. Right. But what it's also done is it's pulled the prices back, which in my opinion creates buyer opportunity, even if rates aren't great. Why? Because there's no other financial vehicle in the world that allows you to finance an asset or leverage an asset at 90% or 95% or whatever down payment you're going to use, right? And lock your interest rate for 30 years, and your worst case scenario is rates actually get better, and then you can have that rate too.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah. You lock it in. If it gets worse, you're there. So now it's better.
Right.
You have a better rate.
All these people that bought houses early last year, the year before, at 3% interest rates, they're locked in for 30 years. There's no reason they should ever get rid of that mortgage. Right? But so that's why this financial vehicle is so powerful, right? But so people right now are not buying because of the higher interest rates. But let's look at this example. So by saving in that particular case, by saving 2% on the loan amount, 2%. So from 8.3 to 6.5%, okay, you'd save $47,000 over the life of the loan. Okay, that's about $1,500 per year in interest. Okay, so are you really gonna not buy something over $1,500 a year, or like $120, $130 per month? Right, like. Again, I understand qualifying power. Somebody can't qualify for it, that's different. But somebody that's like, I could have gotten it last year for $100 a month cheaper. Yeah, you could have. And if you wait another year, it's going to be another $200 more expensive. But the whole point is, like, I just showed you that this property appreciated $450,000 in 30 years. That's a $15,000 per year appreciation. So you're going to give up $15,000 per year in appreciation
to save your $1,500.
To save $1,500?
Doesn't make sense.
Like, you will never outsave the real estate market. So if you're like sitting around going, I got to save more money so I can buy a house, you'll never outsave it. Like, a $500,000 property is going to be worth $520 next year, or $525,000. You going to save $25,000 in a year?
Most people probably not.
No, the majority of people are not going to be able to do that. You can't outside the market. That's why leverage is so powerful.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why a 3% down payment is powerful. Because if houses go up 25,000, you only need $750. Right? $25,000 increase in price, you need $750 more to buy it on a 3% down payment. Right? And so
what I think I want people to take away from this episode really is, I think it was Albert Einstein that said, I think he was the one that said that compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with appreciation, right? Like appreciation is just compounding interest, compounding appreciation on a property, right? Like if people can understand how powerful it is, right? When people show you, maybe your 401k provider wants to show you what your 401k is going to be worth after contributing $5,000 every year. And I would love to sit down with you and show you what your $5,000 contribution to real estate would be worth at the end of, 30 years, right?
And beyond the 30 years, it's having access to that anytime you need it.
Yeah, right. And there's a couple other episodes that we're going to do that we have that we'll talk about what you can do once you build that portfolio, because that's really incredible. Like, especially the tax benefits, the tax advantage, like just a little sneak preview of one of our future episodes. But if you get a portfolio that's worth $10 million every year at 5% appreciation, right? That portfolio is going to increase in value by $500,000. And you can technically refinance that and re-leverage that piece, or re-leverage the whole thing at 80% or even 75%, even 50%, which means you could take essentially, $250,000, $300,000, $350,000 out of that equity every year and live on it as a cash out refinance. And a cash out refinance is not a taxable event. It's not taxable income. So build yourself a $10 million portfolio, right? It doesn't even have to cash flow. No cash flow at all, right? It just has to, and the principal alone, if you fully leveraged $10 million, principal paid out a loan on $10 million, that's a lot. It's over $100,000 a year, right? And so just the appreciation alone, you could just borrow that back, right? And then yes, your mortgage payment would increase, but you increase your rents to offset that, right? And even if you didn't, you'd have $250,000 of non-taxable income or money in your bank that you could use to pay the small offset in the mortgage and then live on the rest, right? So anyway, we'll talk about that later down the road. But I think that's kind of that's the end for today's episode. And I think there's a ton of good info here, and hopefully, we can be a resource for you moving forward. And if you really want to learn more, go check out, first of all, our Black Yeti Group webpage. Again, that's www.blackyetigroup.com. My real estate team, the Meta Homes team, you can check out our websites, our socials. They'll all be in the description. And then don't forget to subscribe so you get the upcoming podcast episodes that we have every Wednesday. And leave us a comment. We might even answer, if you got a question, we might even answer in one of our later episodes. So make sure, please join me next week. We'll be reviewing some real estate return metrics so you can understand when we talk some of the different acronyms. You'll know what we're talking about. And so thank you so much for tuning in. And remember, live big. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Live Big Podcast. For even more real estate and investment resources, go to blackyetigroup.com/resources and download Nick's complete guide to running your own rental properties. Tune back in next week for another episode, and until then, live big.
Live Big does not provide investment, legal, or tax advice, and nothing herein should be construed as being financial, legal, tax, or other advice. Live Big does not represent that any securities or services discussed are suitable for any investor. No investment or other decision should be made solely based on the contents or information found on the website or podcast. When making a decision about your investments, you should seek the advice of a professional financial advisor or qualified expert.